Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. In our last episode, we examined the tumultuous centuries following Kilwa's successful revolt against the Shanga. After two separate revolts against their Shanga conquerors though, Kilwa's Shirazi Dynasty was restored, but peace would not be. Instead, two different Shirazi sultans would be overthrown by local revolts in an era known for its instability. However, after emerging from this era of tumult, Kilwa will undergo a metamorphosis. Let's see what we've been building up to for a while. Kilwa taking its early steps to become the greatest power in East Africa. Season 6, Episode 9, The Height of the Shirazi Dynasty. In 1131, the people of Kilwa had overthrown its tyrannical and immoral ruler, and replaced him with his son, Dawood ibn Suleiman. Now, to get straight to the point, Dawood ibn Suleiman is not going to be the guy who is fundamental in leading Kilwa into its first golden age and the height of the Shirazi dynasty referred to in the episode's title. But he is going to play an important part in setting up a successor to fulfill that role. The important note of detail is what Dawood was getting up to prior to being crowned by rebels. According to the Chronicle, the young prince Dawood ibn Suleiman was working as a merchant at the harbor of Sofala across the sea. To reiterate, Sofala was a settlement located on the mainland of modern Mozambique, far to Kilwa's south. The port acted as a main trade entrepot between the goldfields of the Zambezi and Limpopo river valleys, and was operated primarily by Somali merchants from Mogadishu in its early years. Apparently, they operated the settlement with the consent of a local king, who enjoyed the financial benefits that foreign trade brought to his little fiefdom. However, according to the Chronicle, he didn't entirely trust these foreign merchants. To quote the Portuguese version of the Chronicle, it was part of the agreement between the pagans and the Moors of Mogadishu that every year they should send some young Moors so that there be at least one of the race there. Essentially, they had a hostage arrangement. The Somalis would promise to have at least one of their own in Sofala at all times so that, for the sake of the hostages' safety, they wouldn't be tempted to do anything against the local king's wishes, and in exchange were given access to that trading post. Again, according to the Chronicle, the Somalis supposedly tried to keep this entrepot of Sofala secret, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. At an undefined time before Dawood ibn Suleiman's life, a fisherman from Kilwa was trying to catch his next dinner, when a sudden current swept him off course, surprisingly, and carried him to the coast of Mozambique. The beleaguered fisherman sailed around for a few days, desperately struggling to find land, and was apparently on the verge of death by the time that he reached Sofala. Now back in civilization, the fisherman recovered from his brutal trip, and began to notice the abundance of gold that was being exchanged in the market. From there, he caught the next ship up to Mogadishu, and then departed partway through to return home to Kilwa. Then, after telling the Sultan at the time about the trade port he encountered, the Sultan vowed that he would find a way for Kilwa to insert itself into this trade. He sent a large diplomatic expedition to Sofala, who landed in the port and began negotiations with the local king. Kilwa's diplomats agreed to a deal similar to that of Mogadishu's, that in order to keep relations strong, that they would have a permanent colonial community present in Sofala at all times, trading and negotiating with the king in order to represent the interests of the Sultan, as well as acting as, diplomatic hostages. The local king agreed, and, over time, Kilwa gradually began to usurp Mogadishu's dominance over the port. Now, Dawood ibn Suleiman is often conflated with the first generation of Kilwa's mercantile colonists in Sofala, but we don't know if that's actually true. Again, the Chronicle does not explicitly state when Kilwa first became influential in Sofala, or under whose reign this moment occurred. Now, Dawood ibn Suleiman is often assumed to be the first, since he is the first person from Kilwa to be explicitly mentioned as living in Sofala in the Chronicle, which does kind of make it seem like he was part of that first generation of hostages. But regardless of whether he was the first or part of a later group of these diplomatic hostages living in Sofala and trading with the locals, he was quickly recalled after he heard the news that his father had been overthrown for his tyrannical behavior, and that the people wanted him to be the new king. According to the chronicle, Dawood bin Suleiman had achieved quite a personal fortune in his time at Sofala. And while the chronicle doesn't provide much detail on his 40-year reign, other than that it was a time of relative peace and prosperity, we can ascertain that, given what would follow afterward, that his rule saw an increased interest in the power of Kilwa's trade abroad, especially at the significant port of Sofala. After Dawood ibn Suleiman passed away, the Portuguese version of the chronicle states that the kingship of Kilwa was left to Dawood's heir, his son, Hassan Suleiman ibn Dawood. Almost immediately after assuming the rulership of Kilwa, Suleiman turned his attention to the same section of land that had made his father so successful. Now, unfortunately, it's hard to say much with certainty about what Kilwa's settlement in Sofala looked like. That is not even to say the settlement of the Somalis that preceded them. This is because, sadly, the remains of the old settlements are no longer around. Like I mentioned, Sofala during this period was more of an oxymoronic, permanently temporary place. It was a trade depot, but not exactly an urban center, at least not in the proper sense, and at least not yet. Rather, it was basically an unusually wealthy tent city. This limited the extent to which we can identify archaeological sites related to Kilwa's presence in the city, and that was only made worse in later decades. Later accounts would identify that by 1844 at the very latest, the old Muslim quarter, as it was called, of Sofala, the location of the oldest foreign settlements, had been swallowed up by the shifting tides of the coast. As a result, there is no abundance of archaeological data to compare with the chronicle, and, well, there isn't even much that's said in the chronicle itself. But while it doesn't say much about Sofala, the chronicle does closely connect his father's reign with Hassan Suleiman's first attempts to expand Kilwa. The chronicle in particular makes the claim that, quote, because he had his father's blessing, Hassan Suleiman became the master of the Hizgache of Sofala. Now, you might have noticed that I left a conspicuous Portuguese word untranslated in that sentence, and that's because that phrase, master of the Hizgache of Sofala, could be interpreted in quite a few different ways. Hizgache, in different contexts, can be translated to rescue, saving someone from danger. However, it could also be translated as ransom, money that is paid to rescue someone from a kidnapping. To be honest, neither translation makes a whole lot of sense in this context. Master of the rescue of Sofala seems to imply that the settlement was threatened in some way, and that he rescued it somehow. Or maybe it's calling the settlement itself a rescue or refuge, a place where rescues happen, referring to its status not only as a mercantile hub, but as a place of refuge for merchants blown off course. Lord of the ransom of Sofala seems to imply that the Sultan of Kilwa supposedly had a lordship over the region that was strictly financial, that he held authority over its valuable trade, but had no real ability to enforce sovereignty over the region politically, which, to be fair, does seemingly align with what little we know about Kilwa's power in the region. But this is complicated even further by another potential meaning. At the time when the Portuguese translation of the chronicle was written, the word Hizgache had come to take on an entirely different meaning. Portuguese laws had recently started to regulate the means by which Portuguese colonists could enslave indigenous Brazilians in their newly formed South American colony, with this being especially pertinent regarding the enslavement of indigenous people who converted to Christianity. Enslaving other Christians was heavily looked down upon, and so, in order to dodge these regulations, Portuguese colonists often adopted a new euphemism, Hizgache, to refer to the indigenous people who had been enslaved by other indigenous people, and then rescued by the Portuguese through conquering the group that enslaved them. However, rather than truly rescuing these people, it was more like being under new management, as they were integrated into society in a role that was basically slavery in all but name. And so, in the context of this period, the Portuguese word Hizgache started to be applied as a term for enslaved people captured by the Portuguese by war with the people who had initially enslaved them. And this was true not only in Brazil, but in Africa and Asia as well. And eventually, it even started to take off as a more polite and gentle synonym for the purchase of enslaved workers more generally, since after all, are they really enslaving them, or are they just rescuing them, wink wink, from their old slavery? So when referring to Hasan Suleiman as the Lord of the Hesgache of Sofala, the document might be referring to the slave trade, saying that Hasan Suleiman had taken control of this major port in the trade, and so capturing him made him the lord of purchasing enslaved workers. Now, it's worth noting that we don't actually know if Sofala was a major hub of the slave trade in this time, and the little evidence that we do have tends to point to it not being the case. While this little piece of the chronicle could be taken as evidence for that trade, it seems more likely to me that it's simply an anachronism. The Portuguese translator was writing in the early 16th century, a time when Sofala was definitely a major hub in the slave trade, and that he therefore assumed that it must have been true at the time he was writing about as well. I guess a good comparison would be a contemporary writer writing about, say, the Dutch conquest of the island of Taiwan, and saying that they did it to control the